Hello everyone, this is your lecture on developing a story for your short story project that you'll be doing in our final week. I'm just going to really quickly go over a few very basic elements to storytelling. Obviously, if you're really into uh, this sort of writing, you can take creative writing classes and things like that, and they'll get a lot deeper into each one of these things. This is just some basic stuff, some of which you may have already heard in the years past when you've had classes on either creative writing or even literature. We'll sometimes talk about these things. So this might just be a refresher for some of you, but please do pay attention because it's very critical to understanding what I'm looking for when it comes to your short story projects. So the first thing I'll say, and one of the things that a lot of people sort of forget, is the most basic element of storytelling, right? And that is that the one thing every story has to have, absolutely must have, or it's not a story, is conflict. Okay? There must be conflict in every story. Conflict is what drives the story. Otherwise, you're just explaining something, right? You need a conflict at the heart of every story. That conflict can be between people, two people, groups of people, whatever. It can be between ideas. It can be a conflict between certain forces. Lots of different types of conflict. It can be between someone's own desires or needs or impulses or whatever. Lots of ways to tell, or lots of different kinds of conflict that can exist. The important thing is that you recognize what the conflict in your story is. So one of the things I'll probably ask you when we do our when I'm talking to you about this is what's the conflict, right? Or if I can't find the conflict in the story, that's the thing I'm going to be asking is what is the conflict of the story? I can't see it, right? Like if I can't understand as a reader what the conflict is, you probably have a problem on your hands, okay? Now the three basic elements of storytelling are the same ones that you learned when you were in fourth grade, right? Um, there are three elements of storytelling: setting, plot, and character, right? I'll start with setting. It's pretty simple. Where and when does this story take place? How do these conditions impact what takes place? So if your story is set in a rural community, does that mean people live on larger tracts of land? Does it mean that there's less internet access? Does it mean there are more wooded areas? All these things could factor into your story, right? If it takes place in 1985, does it mean people are using payphones and cassette tapes? Will personal computers be far less common? Will the Cold War still be a thing because it's 1985, right? All these things will play into sort of the conditions under which your story can take place and then ultimately will impact your story, right? Number two, plot. What happens? Okay? Plot seems fairly easy to understand, but it's actually pretty complicated when you consider all the different options you have for creating a plot, right? Uh, Also, it's not just what happens, it's in what order it happens. Some people call this the narrative arc, right? And here's a plot structure that you've probably all seen before with the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution laid out here on this little arc. Um, this is a very basic sort of plot structure, but you can sort of fit everything into here if you want to. Um, it's very linear as it's drawn out like this, but it doesn't have to take place in this order if you don't want it to, right? So a linear sort of narrative is when things happen in chronological order, okay? So first this thing happens, then that thing happens, then that thing, and you're at the end, okay? Just because it's linear doesn't mean that things can't skip ahead in time, right? So you could have a scene that takes place and then the next scene could be 10 weeks later. It just means that the audience is somewhat aware that these things are taking place in chronological order. Okay? So if you do skip large chunks of time in your linear story, it's probably good to signal to your audience in some way that you have jumped forward in time a great deal, or they're assumed that the thing that happens next happens right after the thing that happened before it. Okay? So in some way, if you're going to do a linear story, make it clear to your audience where in time this thing takes place, and if you're jumping ahead in time, make sure that they know that that's taking place. Okay. You can also do non-linear stories. Um, to some degree, our handicap league story might fall into this because there are scenes in that story where it's not clear where they exist in the narrative all the time, like chronologically. But that's what a fractured narrative seemingly or is, right? It exists seemingly independent of time, so the audience doesn't know if the scenes are in chronological order or how time is passing. Okay, Um, yeah. Another nonlinear element is something called flashback, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's when the story jumps into the past. Usually it's to provide context or exposition, right? And then there's a sort of, I guess, a narrative move that people sometimes do called in media res, in the middle of things. It means like when your narrator drops right into or starts the story right in the middle or somewhere along the line, and then has to go back. Sometimes this is famously done where you start with what you would consider the climax of the story, and then you sort of go back and explain how everything got to that point. That's one way of doing it. Sometimes you do it somewhere in the middle of the rising action. Just depends on sort of where you want to go back from, right? So there's that. That's plot. Character. This is one that also sometimes people tend to neglect. Who is involved and how can you show the audience the details of this person, sensory details, personality traits, and so forth, and then which details are necessary and which aren't. Now, if you look at the story that we read for today, Handicap League, you'll notice that one of the great elements of this story is that the characters are very vivid, right? So you have Dodson, you have Hotz, you have Jeffy, and you have the narrator. Those are the big characters in this story, right? The narrator is an interesting character. He's unnamed, but he or she, it's he, gives a lot of description about himself, about the things that he does, about his own perspective, and then at the end, of course, flips our expectations about his own perspective and who he is, right? So you see the conflict happening there between Peterson Insurance and this college bowling team. And then at the end, one of the interesting moves of the story is that you've gained a sense of who this narrator is throughout the whole thing. And in the last paragraph or two, he's like, wait, you see me as this way, but maybe I'm this other way. Maybe I'm like this entitled, spoiled kid, right? So it's an interesting way that the narrator there uses character on himself and says, like, me as your narrator, I'm maybe not as great as you thought I was, you know? So a big part of your process for like writing this sort of thing will be selecting details for each character so that we can have a sense of what details matter and you can exclude all the ones that don't, okay? Other aspects of good storytelling, I'm going to just give you 3. Pacing, how quickly or slowly do certain moments come and go? If you rush through something, the audience will assume it's not important. If you dwell on something, the audience will assume it's important, okay? So if you sort of spend a bunch of time, you know, in one scene, we're going to assume that's a really important scene. So don't spend a bunch of time in a scene that just sort of setting something else up or isn't really going to be a big important moment, okay? Space, and by space I mean how many words you devote to a given thing, okay? This is kind of connected to pacing, right? The more words you spend on something, the more important the audience thinks it is. So if you spend a ton of time describing a door, that door better be super important, okay? If you spend a ton of time describing a person, that person better be super important, okay? Because you've spent a lot of time on it, so now your audience thinks, okay, this guy must be really important. But if you spend a whole bunch of time describing a secondary or tertiary character, it's not going to do you a lot of good if that character has no, you know, really no impact on the story, okay? Concision, and I hope we're going to get a chance to practice this. Concision is not using superfluous wording, not using extra wording. Tight, concise sentences make the reader feel like things are going faster. And if things are going faster, usually we're more inclined to pay attention to them and to stick with them, okay? The last thing you want, at least for a modern reader, not a reader from the 18th century, is for somebody to be like, oh, this is dragging on, hurry up, you know? So write tight sentences and they won't feel that way, okay? This is also somewhat a stylistic preference. I really, really prefer concise sentences. Some people are a little more willing to sort of stick around for sort of long, prosy sentences that are just sort of like meant to be very impressive in their own sense. Not me. I like them nice and tight and nice and concise, okay? That's all I have for you right now. If you have any questions or anything, let me know.